of the fabric of daily life, a rough account of it, because it's too rich. Especially in this country, once you get off the interstate, the fabric of daily life is very rich. Something like the distinction I'd want to make between a sort of theoretical approach and an approach more rooted in daily life to the issues that we'll be discussing, I'm just laying some of them out now, is the difference between driving cross-country on the interstate or flying over it and then occasionally taking the back roads. This is very interesting driving through the South, but it's also interesting driving through the Midwest. Because the United States is not the kind of country. You notice how after Hegel we've started giving a theory of the present and stuff? See, that was what we promised we'd do, is that philosophy at its best should be our time comprehended in thought. That keeps it from being what Nietzsche says, sort of a museum of ideas. He says, you know, which is built for loafers in the garden of knowledge. Nietzsche's phrase. Well, for philosophy to be more than that sort of museum of ideas built for loafers in the garden of knowledge, it needs to give an intransigent account of conditions in the present. Now, it could be wrong, okay? I told you I was a fallibleist. What I'm saying now could be wrong, but that shouldn't be decided by slogans or TV commercials or by Willie Horton ads, but by debate, by argument among a public body, citizens talking and arguing. Now, the further problem, and this is a problem that Marx in part is implicated in, is the way in which political discourse has, as it were, dried up and narrowed. The things about which we can debate, the topics which are open for alternatives and for other explanations and descriptions. And this is the deep sense in which I have used the word pseudo-democracy instead of democracy throughout. Because even in its Greek form, where it was limited only to Greeks who were citizens, not slaves or not foreigners, even there, the institutions of representation where people could be recalled much quicker. See, it's hard to recall someone who, once they get in this city. Not many people come back. We didn't like it. And again, why not? Well, because in the current situation, as many events that have just happened, I think, indicate political power and economic power are deeply interlocked. It seems to me hardly accidental that most of the people in the Senate are millionaires. I think all but what? One or two? They're all millionaires. Is that just an accident? An accidental relation? Most of them white guys. Notice that? Accidental relation? No. See, that's the kind of prima facie evidence one should look at. You should go, well, that just looks like a bunch of white guys at some really rich club in New York. Well, it is like them. In fact, when they go to New York, it is them. Now, that's not a conspiracy theory because all of them appear on TV and tell you they're running your lives. So it's not a conspiracy. The deep insight Marx has, and it's really an important one, is that whatever, and by the way, this is not a sufficient condition for what we would like to call a good or excellent human life, but it's a necessary condition. Necessary but not sufficient. Is that you not have your life reduced to total poverty. That's this, in other words, it's not enough to just be free from constraints. You can't be just reduced to penury and then say that that person has a free life. And on the other hand, you can't have your life reduced to work, no matter how high the wage, and have it be a really excellent life. That reduction of life to work itself cripples life and cripples the challenge to become something else, larger, other. And it's only in that sense that we started with these philosophical ideals, because each one of them points the way it projects other than, right? Other than simply being the person who sold the most tires, who pushed the most papers through the largest office. Each one of them. In that regard, let me refer back to a really old one, Alexander the Great on finding a skeptic in the streets, a really famous philosopher. And this guy was really just totally otherworldly. All he did was just think and lay in the streets, and he was really dirty. And some of Alexander the Great's officers, and by the way, Alexander the Great did better than George Bush ever will. Conquered the whole world, you know, and he was like, what, 26 or so. Younger than Dan Quayle, probably just as sharp. And he sees this old philosopher lying in the streets, and he said, well, if I wasn't Alexander, I would want to be that man. The reason is that they both had extreme and extremely interesting projects. It's hard for us to even have a sense for a project like that now, because our projects have been reduced to a series of bills, petty annoyances, and in our spare time, the search for what little meaning is left over from all that busyness and chatter that goes into that process. Now, this is not, I mean, I'm aiming it at this audience because we're here. So please don't get confused. I'm not a foreign agent. I don't know a government in the world where I couldn't say similar things, and in most governments, some worse. Now, I don't want any complacency about my lecture or that to be viewed as me pulling back from what I've said, because it is no argument, and it never has been, to say our tribe is a little better than everybody else's, so that's fine. You know why that's no argument, don't you? Well, if you're among tribes of savages and you only lop off 20,000 heads a year as opposed to 19, that's no lopping off heads argument. Even if you are the greatest tribe in the world, a claim that we believe a priori true. In any case, now, to try to summarize these sort of far-ranging and sort of nasty anti-Republican polemics here, or whatever, left-wing talk, what I've been trying to fill out today for you is a richer notion of freedom in which we recognize that before moral problems really come up in the philosophical sense, before they really come up, there are conditions for human life that have to be fulfilled, which I call necessary human requirements. They're not sufficient to live a good life, but they're necessary. Among them are food, shelter, ordinary health care. Real exciting, huh? See, that's not as much fun as Kant, but they're real important, because without that, it's hard to follow the categorical imperative. You know, it's easier to follow a ham sandwich without that. So that's a necessary but not a sufficient condition for a good life. It's also, and this is a more radical claim, it's also a necessary but not a sufficient condition that one have the freedom in one's life to pursue other goals than work. And in a strong sense, I'm not talking now about getting a hobby, but a life not reduced to work. Not reduced to work. A life where when you go to a cocktail party and they don't go, what are you? They go, what do you do? And you don't have to answer with your job description, which is another way of asking, who are you in a metaphysical sense, right? That accounts for a lot of the Phil Donahue shows. Women show up and are embarrassed to go, I'm a home worker. I work at home. Why would that be a problem? Well, in a capitalist economy, it's a terrible problem, and here's why. Because housework is unwaged. And since we value labor by the wage it brings, it's not surprising that an old person in a rest home's ability to tell a beautiful story is not valued, because it's not waged. You go to an old folks' home. We ought to realize this. We'll all be we'll either be old or we'll face another alternative that's unpleasant. You go to an old folks' home, that's unwaged labor. They're whittling and they're storytelling. Not valued in our culture, in our society. It's not waged. Housework, no matter how many kids you raise, not really valued. Oh, come on, they'll say something about you on the Today Show if you live to be 100. This woman lived to be 100 and had 9 kids. And you get a little clap, that's it. Other than that, very little social value. All that unwaged labor. The reason it's not valued is because it's not waged. Donald Trump, he opens a hotel. Huge wage, huge wage, huge value to his labor. Well, what the hell did he do? Talk to Merv Griffith in a room for 3 minutes. And that's more valuable than some old man who's lived 90 years worth of experience and can tell a story about his life in which you might find a human meaning. A society that produces that situation is pathological. It neither has nor deserves a very long existence.